Joining us now is Congressman currently from the 4th District, Randy Forbes. He is currently my congressman. He is running for re-election in the 2nd Congressional District, which is currently held by Scott Ridgel. Scott Ridgel retiring, and Congressman Forbes deciding to run for re-election in the 2nd District after the redistricting. And just to set the table for it, there are two other Republican candidates vying for that spot. That is House of Delegates member and former Navy SEAL Scott Taylor, and also Virginia Beach attorney Pat Cardwell. The primary election will be decided in a 2nd District Republican primary open to all registered voters on June 14th. So you want to jot that down if you're in the 2nd District. Now, having said all that, joining us now, my congressman, Congressman Randy Forbes. Sir, good to have you with us.
John, it's always good to be with you.
I want to get right to this Saudi situation. Look, we had the 9/11 report come out. 30 pages were redacted. That kind of raised an eyebrow. Many of us thought there was something in there that may or may not have implicated the Saudis or shed light on what was going on. I think you would agree with me that 5,000 dead. Americans deserve complete transparency as to what went on. Now we've got an effort underway that citizens want to be able to sue the Saudi government. The president has said no. He doesn't want to open up that can of worms. Now the Saudis, Congressman, are threatening us with pulling out $750 billion. For the average American out there, this really doesn't seem like we're standing up for ourselves. And why should we, sir, be allowed to be threatened by the Saudi government, who we basically provide their entire security?
John, first of all, you know, the great two words that you, or actually the big thing that you said there was standing up for ourselves. And one of the things, there are two things that I see with people around the country today that's so frustrating them. The first one is that they feel the United States is bowing down or ignoring bullies all over the world. And what they've seen over the last 8 years, John, is bowing down to bullies or ignoring bullies does not make them go away. And what America wants us to do, they want a president, they want a Congress who'll start standing up to these bullies around the globe. And until we do that, John, we're going to see more and more of this kind of action around the globe.
Well, specifically on the legislation to allow Americans to be able to sue the Saudis, how do you stand?
They ought to be able to sue. They ought to be able to sue these countries when they are victims of attacks, and they can directly relate them to foreign countries.
So you would be in favor of this. Now, what do you think of President Obama threatening to veto that? I mean, is it just this just another example of a
President Obama, John, as you know, has tried to dismantle our military over the last 8 years. I mean, you know, one of the things that we've been fighting for, and one of the great things we did this week, is to begin to turn some of this around. But because with the president, I mean, he has taken our military to a situation. We're on the road to have 237 ships in our Navy. We're in a situation where the Marines are having to go into museums to get parts for their planes so that they can fly them. He wanted to take the Army down to 420 in troop strength. And so we know where the president's going to be. The question is where the American people are going to be and where Congress is going to be.
Okay, let's go to legislation that you have been behind recently, which is representing the highest level of shipbuilding funding since the Reagan era. It's authorizing 3 more warships than Obama had asked for. Can you kind of outline that for our audience, sir?
John, it's what we've been saying all along through this campaign. You know, as you go through these campaigns, you have your opponents always toss a million different grenades at you. But the reality and why we're even running in this race, why we think it's important to be in Congress, is because unless you can be in a position to help turn some of these things around, then all you get to do is do speeches and send out press releases. And this week, we were able to turn something around that many of us believe has needed to be turned around for the last decade or more. When Ronald Reagan was in office, we had 600 ships in the United States Navy. By the time Clinton got out of office, he cut that in half. We had about 310. Today we have 272, and we're on the road to have 237 ships in our Navy. We think it's time to turn that around. And this week, yesterday, as a matter of fact, my subcommittee with the bill that I wrote, we put the largest investment in shipbuilding and ship construction since the Reagan era. And we began to turn this around. And it's a huge benefit for us at home as well as for our national security, because this is a down payment on rebuilding a 350-ship Navy, John.
So, Congressman, let's get to the 350-ship Navy. Why is that a magic number? Why do we have to have another, whatever the number is, another 100 ships? I mean, the Navy right now is running ads on TV, sir, saying, hey, this is your Navy going around the world, rebuilding other countries, helping other people out, doing aid. Look, we got $20 trillion in debt. And why is the U.S. Navy running ads about what they're going to do for Haitian building around the globe when we've got 25,000 people in Los Angeles living on the street?
Yeah, well, John, that's a great question, and I'm glad you raised it. First of all, let's look at, I can't tell you the ads that the Navy runs or not, but I can tell you the threats that the Navy is looking around the globe. What the Navy is seeing is they're seeing Russia rebuilding their capability to 80% of what it was in the Cold War. They're seeing the Chinese, that they're going to have twice the number of submarines we have in just over a decade. They're seeing the Iranians right now firing missiles over the bows of our ship, taking 12 of our sailors captive. They're seeing the Russians buzz our ship at 30 feet above one of our ships, and the real reason is because we don't have enough ships right now to cover the globe and do what we need to do to defend the country. And when you're talking about why do we need more ships, because if I have one less aircraft carrier, just as an example, the sailors and the men and women in the United States Navy who live in our area get another 2.5 months they have to be deployed overseas. So they go from 7 months, John, to 9 months or 9.5 months. That's more anniversaries their away, more birthdays they're away from their families, and that's just wrong. You know, they shouldn't have to go on these deployments more than 6 or 7 months. The other thing, John, just coming back to your economy, when you look at the economy of scales, for example, in this mark, in just one situation, we cut the cost down by doing this build-out the way we're doing it. We're going to buy 12 submarines, but we only have to pay the price of 11 because we are building them like this. Sometimes you get these efficiencies of scales that the Russians and Chinese are getting, and we've been ignoring them. One last point, John. Tomahawk missiles. We've doubled the number of Tomahawk missiles we have because it doesn't do us any good to have ships out there if they're not going to have bullets to fire. And here's the bottom line. The president wants 100 Tomahawks. If he gets 100, they cost $2 million apiece. If we get 198, they cost $1 million apiece. Do that math, and it makes sense to do what we're doing. Final thing is, when you're talking about the people in L.A. who are out of jobs, I'm worried about the people in Hampton Roads who are going to be out of jobs. We've got the largest manufacturing operation in the country is at Newport News and the shipbuilding that's going on down there. You know, when you look at our economy, and 45% of it is directly related to DOD spending, 36% of our jobs, that's where my focus is. This bill keeps 200 jobs in Little Creek. This bill helps thousands of workers who are building our ships in Hampton Roads, but also thousands of them who are repairing those ships. So that's why this bill is what the National Defense University, by the way, John, a couple people from there called this historic. That's why it's so important to get this legislation out.
So what are the barriers to make it a reality, Congressman?
This is going to be a reality. It's passed out of my subcommittee yesterday. The great thing is, chairman of the committee, you get to write these bills. This is my bill. I got to write it, put it in here. It passed yesterday. It'll pass on the Armed Services Committee next Thursday, and then it's going on to the floor, and I'm confident it'll pass out of the House of Representatives. And then we're on our way to get it implemented and to begin turning this curve around, John, because I'm just tired of us bowing down and ignoring these bullies around the world. I want to give the men and women who are fighting these fights the resources they need to win the fights, John. This is a big step in that direction.
I want to get, if I might, to just a timeline for us. If it does pass the House, it's a significant increase, obviously, in defense authorization spending. It's going to go to the Senate. I mean, we've seen so much legislation, Congressman Forbes, go to the Senate and just dies. It's never acted on. What happens there?
Well, first of all, I'm optimistic because, John, one of the things, you're right. Some of these people, they file bills, then they send out press releases, here's a bill. The difference with this one is we didn't just come to this rodeo yesterday. We've been working on this for years, pulling together the coalitions to help make this happen. Just last week, we had John Lehman, as you probably know. John Lehman was the Secretary of Navy under Ronald Reagan, who was the architect of the Reagan Navy. He testified before the Armed Services Committee that I was right. We needed 350 ships. Bob Natter, who used to be in Hampton Roads, Fleet Forces Command, he's probably spent as much time in the 7th Fleet as anybody. He testified before our committee that I was right. We needed 350 ships, and I have been meeting with the Navy. The Navy's now going to do a new force assessment. They've been saying they only needed 308 ships. They're now saying they're going to come up pretty close to where I am on number of ships. So I'm real optimistic when this goes over to the Senate. The Senate's going to say this is right for the country. We need to turn in this direction.
All right, so you seem to be confident that this is going to turn into something, and I do appreciate, Congressman Forbes, what you said earlier about representatives putting legislation out, sending a press release out. They know it isn't going to go anywhere. That's kind of, for the people that follow this stuff like us and our listeners, that's very disingenuous, obviously. But it's going to get to President Obama's desk. How do you expect the president to react to this?
Well, this is going to be, and that's the great thing, John. You see, a lot of people don't realize, because when on these independent, standalone bills, people put their names on them, and they say, well, he's got his name on this bill. The National Defense Bill doesn't have anybody's name on it, and the reason is it is a bill that we have passed with all the gridlock in Congress. The National Defense Bill gets passed every year for over 50 years because it's a crucial bill, and the president, whether it's Republican or Democrat, signed that bill into law because it's the national security of this country. When that bill gets out of there, this whole portion that I get to write and put in that bill, it's going to be a part of the National Defense Bill, and I believe very strongly the President of the United States is going to do what every other president's been doing for the last 50-some years. He's going to sign this bill into law, and we're going to start rebuilding some of these resources that they've taken out for the last 8 years.
How will that affect the national debt? Obviously, if you're putting this money in, which seems to be the right thing to do, Congressman Forbes, from what you've said, but there's not a corresponding decrease in spending.
Oh, absolutely, there is. This is coming out, John, of the budget that will already be passed in Congress and dollars that are approved. The other thing you got to realize is a couple of things. John, there are a lot of projects around the country that we are wasting money on that I would rather put money in national defense than some of these boondoggle projects that this administration has invested money in other parts of the country. The second thing is, all this would require is about a 1 or 1.5% shift in the defense budget, even within the budget, to build these ships and get the resources we need. But the third thing, that I'd point out to you, in this bill, we've got a lot of savings. We're not letting the Department of Defense have a blank check. We're going to audit the Department of Defense and make sure we know where their dollars are. We're going to make them more efficient. As I told you, it just makes more sense for us to be able to build things that we can get them 20% cheaper than to pay more money and get fewer platforms out there. But the bottom line, John, it's just right. I am sick and tired of us having our men and women that we're sending into combat that have half the training hours they're supposed to have when their opponents are having all the training hours they're supposed to have. I don't want to put them on planes that their grandfathers flew. I want to make sure that they have the best resources possible to win these fights, because if we lose these fights, John, none of this other stuff matters.
Okay, Congressman, I've got a couple more minutes. I want to get to NATO. The front runner for the Republican nomination, Donald Trump, has called into question, he said, blind following of the NATO rules. He says it's got to be relooked at. He said we're paying 89% of all of the freight. We've got 29 nations now in NATO. The majority of these we have no strategic interest in, and we get stuck paying for it all. How do you stand on this?
I think every single day we should look and reanalyze almost everything we do. All of our alliances, we have to constantly be doing it. I am really worried right now, John, about the resourcing of NATO anyway, if they had a major conflict. And you're exactly right. We need to make sure that if you have that conflict, it's not some kind of paper tiger that we're just putting money in. But I think it can be a very good alliance if it works. But it's not just NATO we need to look at. You know, I've been fighting for a long time on the United Nations. We put so much money in the United Nations, and I guarantee you, John, you couldn't answer today. I couldn't answer today. You can't find anybody in the administration that can tell you even how much money we're putting in the United Nations, and that money sometimes is like throwing it down a dark hole. I think we need to look at all those expenditures. So you're talking about national defense. I'd love to take dollars we're putting in the United Nations and put that in the national defense of this country.
Makes a lot of sense. Final question. Let's get to South China Sea. A little tensions going on there. Should we react or just hold steady?
The biggest thing, John, if you ask our admirals around the globe, what is happening is because we have been deteriorating our presence and our resources, you are getting Russia, China, Iran, North Korea all getting far more aggressive and acting because, just like you started out, they know the United States isn't going to do anything to them. And I come back to where I started. You don't stop bullies by ignoring them or bowing down to them. You stop them by standing up to them.
All right, we're out of time. I want to thank Congressman Randy Forbes for being with us. Congressman, we always appreciate you coming on. You've always been so accessible to us since the day I got on the air, and I really appreciate it. You answer every question, sir, and I appreciate that. However, I am going to be disappointed that you're not going to be my congressman anymore. What am I going to do with all those signs?
John, you know what? You're going to still be my friend, and you know I'm going to be fighting for the principles and the values you believe in.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks, John.
Congressman, good to have you with us. You want more information, go to Forbes.house.gov. This is the John Fredericks Radio Network. We'll be right back.